But here we are. We finally made it. We're at chapter 21. This is the last chapter in the book of Judges. And I want to ask you if this has ever been a situation you've been in your life, right? So something difficult's come up and you're challenging. Like this often will happen with Christians, because Christians, as we know and as we read our Bible, we recognize that there's kind of as Paul says, it may not be required, right? All things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial, right? And so maybe you're allowed to do something, but it doesn't mean it's good for you. And we know that there's a code of conduct. We know that there's a moral compass and a guide that's meant to show us this is how we ought to live. But every so often, we're really good at this. But these circumstances, if you really think about it, the way that it's worded in the book of Leviticus, it didn't really exclude. You hear this a lot with people with tattoos, and I'm not even going into a thing on tattoos right now, but it's just funny that whenever someone brings that up, they're like, well, the thing is, and it's what we like to refer to as looking for that loophole. I'm sure you hear a lot of that at work. Right? People love loopholes. They like trying to find a way to skirt around something that they don't have to do. And again, I just pick tattoos because I just know that that's one that people love to get into and argue with. Alcohol was one that we talked about last year or a couple years ago, where people love to get into loophole territory instead of just actually arguing on the merits. And the reason I bring all that up is because this is going to be demonstrated really, really well for us here in the book of Judges in chapter 21. So if you remember what happened, so we started off in chapter 19. Remember I said 19 through 21 is all one story. So 19, the Levite is on this journey to get his concubine back. She ends up going through a very tragic, very horrific death, only to have her body completely dismembered and sent out to the tribes. It gathers the nation for war. They get mad. They want justice. They go seek the justice, and God has his justice with not only the tribe of Benjamin, but even with the other tribes as well, as he makes them suffer losses because they were not all innocent. As I said, this is a story of all villains and no heroes. And so now here we are. We finally finished, and if you remember, 600 men were all that was left of the tribe of Benjamin. They had nearly wiped out the entire tribe of Israel. And if you're looking in your Bible right now, you may even notice on the top of chapter 21, there's a little subtitle on most of it. It says, The Wives for the Benjamites. So 21 verse 1, the men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah. Not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite, right? Because they are mad. They are angry. And we've talked about this before, right? Making bad vows. When should you never make a vow? This is an easy, first off, the Bible tells us you just shouldn't make a vow. Don't do it. It's silly. But really, you shouldn't make a vow when you're feeling heated. How many of us have said something that we regret later when we were really heated? And no hands went up, so you're all lying. So I know the truth, because we all say things. You're getting in an argument with your when you get an argument with a loved one, a parent, spouse, something like that, and you say something you regret, and you even know in that moment, you're like, that was wrong, but I can't let go at this moment because I'm committed to winning this. But it's unfortunate that's exactly what happened here. They made a vow and said, not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. So then the people went to Bethel, where they sat before the Lord until evening, raising their voices and weeping bitterly. Lord of Israel, they cried, why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today? I think it's just, I chuckle because I think it's funny. Why has this happened? Well, you guys just did it. You know why this happened. You guys were the ones that went out and did the slaughter. Early the next day, the people built an altar and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Israelites asked, who from all the tribes of Israel has failed to assemble before the Lord? Right? They're looking for a loophole. All the ones that went to Mizpah said, we won't give our daughters away. But wait a minute, who wasn't here when we did this? For they had taken a solemn oath that anyone who failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah was to be put to death. So now the Israelites grieved for the tribe of Benjamin and their fellow Israelites, and today one tribe is cut off from Israel. They said, how can we provide wives for those who are left, since we have taken an oath by the Lord not to give them any of our daughters in marriage? And then they asked, which one of the tribes of Israel failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah? And they discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp for the assembly. Aha! For when they counted the people, they found that none of the people of Jabesh Gilead were there. We found a loophole. Technically, they didn't take the vow, did they? So the assembly sent 12,000 fighting men with instructions. Can you imagine this? So they sent soldiers to go do this. Fighting men with instruction to go to Jabesh Gilead and put to the sword those living there, including the women and children, right? Because remember what they said, they took a solemn oath that they had to gather or else they were going to be put to death. This is a very strange story, and if you're confused by it, that's okay, because I went through it a couple times before I went, okay, and this is why, once again, don't make a dumb vow. Don't make vows. As the Bible said, let your yes be yes and your no be no, right? Don't make a vow, because it's going to cause you to do something stupid. So they went there, put to sword all those living there, including the women and children, and this is what you are to do. Kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin. Aha, loophole. We're going to spare those young women because they're going to need them later. So they found among the people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man. And so they took them to the camp at Shiloh in Canaan. And then the whole assembly sent an offer of peace to the Benjamites at the rock of Rimmon. And so the Benjamites returned at that time and were given the women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared, but there was not enough for all of them. If you remember, there were 600 men that survived, and we only got 400 women here. I mean, rough. So there wasn't enough for them to actually all have wives in order for them to actually begin to repopulate the tribe of Benjamin. So the people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a gap in the tribes of Israel. And the elders of the assembly said, with the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left? And so the Benjamite survivors must have heirs, they said, so that a tribe of Israel will not be wiped out. We can't give them our daughters as wives since the Israelites have taken an oath, right? Okay, we've made this promise. We said before the Lord, we will never give them. We're never going to give them. This is important, our daughters. Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to a Benjamite. But look, there's have you noticed there's this annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, which lies north of Bethel, east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Labona. So they instructed the Benjamites, saying, go and hide in the vineyards and watch, and when the young women of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each one of you seize one of them to be your wife. Go out and kidnap a wife, because then we're not giving them to you. You're stealing our women. Right? It's not much better, is it? This is the weirdest loophole you're probably ever going to read about. I just love your face, Rebecca. You're like, what? It is truly the strangest thing, one of the strangest things and this is, again, one of the reasons why I love the Bible. The Bible doesn't hold back. It doesn't hide the ugly truth of things that happened in the past, right? And that's why I find it so credible, because when victors write history, we usually try to write it a little bit more flattering about ourselves. We don't like to include all the negativity and the ugly things, and yet God made sure that everything, warts and all, was included in this story. So go out and seize and be your wife, then return to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers and brothers complain to us, we will say to them, do us a favor of helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war. You will not be guilty because of breaking your oath, because you did not give your daughters to them. Can you imagine that? I'm not sure if you caught what they just said there. So when the fathers of these young women who get kidnapped by these men of Benjamin go, hey, what are you doing? they're going to come along and say, actually, you're kind of doing them a favor, and you didn't technically give them to a Benjamite, so you're in the clear. You're helping your tribe, so just let your daughter stay. They're using one crime to cover over another crime. So that is what the Benjamites did, and while the young women were dancing, each man... I love how NIV puts it. I know different versions put it a different way, but it says each one caught one. This is a woman. Went out and caught her. I don't know, was it like with a fishing net or something? He just walked around just netting women and carried her off to be his wife. And then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt their towns and settled in them. And at that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. And in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So this is the end of the book of Judges. And you'll notice that as we started off at the beginning of the book of Judges, things... And this is one of those things. It's as I say, it's a warning given out to all nations, and we need to heed this warning because we need to recognize that this can happen to us, right? Everyone always says, "Well, it can't happen here." We were talking about this actually. Was it at Games Night where we were talking about 9/11? I think it was, yeah. And we were talking about how shocking that moment was because everyone thought it could never happen here. And it can't until it does. And then suddenly it happened. And we do the same things with the warnings that the Bible gives us. We say, well, that won't happen because, it's different now. We wouldn't go down this path. We wouldn't do these things. And yet how many times have we seen similarities with all of these other judges in the way that our society is today, or even our churches are becoming? Right? If you remember when we were talking about Micah and his idols, this is a man who thought he was serving the Lord and yet was also worshiping the idols. As we come here to the very last chapter of Judges and we see, as this closes out the story of this time period, we saw how they fell further and further and further away from God. That they continued to go down this path where, as the author continues to remind us, Israel had no king. And who was meant to be their king? God. And everyone instead did as they saw fit. Now remember, Moses has already been to the mountain. He's already spoke to the Lord. He's already received the law from God. They know how they ought to live. They know. They have the code before them, the very law of God. They know how they ought to live and how they ought to be, and yet they allow themselves to deviate from that and instead follow their own whims and desires, their own passions. And it leads them to fall away from the call of God. Now, I've heard this said, well, yeah, but we live in a different time. We don't have to follow the law. Now, you're right. Yeah, okay, we're not under the law. That's fair. We're under grace. That's true. But nonetheless, is it also true that we allow things to come into our churches, we allow things to come into our families, we allow things to come into our very lives that are ungodly? And it didn't happen in one day where suddenly one day Micah was making a pilgrim up to the temple at Bethel to suddenly worshiping idols. It was a little by little, day by day, little changes over time. Right? It's making an exception here, a loophole there, that eventually led the nation of Israel, in this case, to fall away from God. In fact, as we finish out Judges and we move first into the book of Ruth, but then into 1 Samuel, it says Samuel was hearing from God. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story. Samuel hears from God, right? And they don't recognize the voice. The priests don't recognize that God is speaking to them because they've fallen that far away from the Lord. People have often said that to me. They said, well, how do I know whether or not it's God? And it's like, well, if you spend more time in the Word, if you spend more time in prayer and pray and praying to God, it's like being out in a crowd and you can recognize that voice of your friend because you spend time with them, you know them, and you can recognize their voice distinctly through the air. But it takes time. It takes determination. And fortunately, we have the opportunity of a good warning. Someone else has already lived this out. The history has already been written. And so we don't have to go down that same path that Israel did. We can look at their story. We can see that time and time again, we shouldn't make vows. Okay, so other than marrying your wife, okay, Jordan, that was a good one. Okay, that was a good vow. Brittany pops around the corner. Yep. Right, you shouldn't be making vows. We learn time and time again that this godlessness just ends up leading to ruin and people wondering, well, where is God now? Well, it's funny how we like to call on God when things are bad and after we've completely rejected him. And then we go, well, why does he allow suffering in the world? Well, maybe because we've rejected him time and time and time again. Why are things getting so bad? Why did God allow the tribe of Benjamin to be destroyed? Do you not remember the story about how evil and wicked and vile they had become, and then they defended it? This could have been resolved. They could have easily just handed over the wicked men, and the whole situation would have been resolved quite easily. But instead, they chose to stand by their evil and wicked deeds. Friends, these are the kinds of things that we have to examine in our own lives and our own hearts. And it's something that I try to make sure I do this all the time. There's one book I love to read. I read it, I'll call it semi-often. I used to read a lot more than I do now. But it's called Who You Are When No One's Looking. Right? Because that's what's really important. Who are we when there's no one else around and when we're in the quiet and there's only God there? How is it that we behave? What kind of things are we inviting into our lives? What things are we allowing to make pathways into our lives? And are we sure that it's only Jesus?